Welcome to Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters, a podcast where we talk about historical drama films and series as windows to the past and mirrors of the present. I'm Michon Boston.
And I'm Jaquina Boston. The Gilded Age, the HBO original drama series from Downton Abbey creator Julian Fellowes, debuts its third season June 22nd. This story of old and new money, haves and strivers, is set in New York in the 1880s, a period of immense economic, political, and social change in the United States. The main story centers around the new-moneyed Russells and their old-moneyed neighbors, the Brookes. The Russells, Bertha and George, set their sights on prizes that would socially and financially elevate the family to unimaginable heights, while the Brookes are managing a domestic power struggle as household fortunes change hands between two sisters. Agnes, whose son loses the Van Ryn money in Season 2, and Ada, now a widow with a newfound fortune, is the new lady of the house because she pays the bills.
In our podcast about the Gilded Age, we talk about an ongoing parallel storyline, the Scott family, who are giving audiences a window to Brooklyn's Black community in the late 19th century. Peggy, the daughter, is a secretary in the Brooks household in Manhattan, as well as a published journalist and writer. Her father, Arthur Scott, formerly enslaved before the Emancipation Proclamation, owns a pharmacy, and Dorothy Scott, Peggy's mother, is a music teacher from Maryland. In the Gilded Age's third season, we're introduced to the Kirklands from Newport, Rhode Island, a Black family with deep roots in Newport's African heritage community, with the professional and educational pedigrees to match. Peggy meets William, the Kirklands' handsome doctor's son. Romance is in the air. However, William's mother, Elizabeth, is less than enthusiastic about Peggy pursuing her writing career. Like the Scotts, the Kirklands elevated our curiosity and enthusiasm to share more about Newport, Rhode Island's Black community during the Gilded Age era on this podcast. We were excited to find the Rhode Island Black Heritage Society, which partnered with Newport Mansions on the exhibit Gilded Age Newport in Color at the Rosecliff Mansion in Newport in 2024.
In this podcast, we're talking with two of the exhibit's curators who were advisors to Season 3 of The Gilded Age. Theresa Soni Guzman Stokes, who is Executive Director for the Rhode Island Black Heritage Society, and Keith W. Stokes, Rhode Island State Historian Laureate. Founded in 1975, the Rhode Island Black Heritage Society's primary mission is the preservation of African diaspora descendants' historical artifacts, books, art, papers, and images, as well as facilitating the interpretation efforts by those seeking to enlighten others about Black heritage. Discover more about Rhode Island's rich African historical heritage from this podcast and by visiting the Rhode Island Black Heritage Society's website at riblackHeritage.org.
Welcome, Soni and Keith, to Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
The third season of HBO's The Gilded Age is giving us a window into Rhode Island's African heritage in the 1880s, post-Reconstruction. Our podcast uses historical drama as a portal to learn more about history and its impact on the present day. Jaquina and I are specifically interested in undertold stories. In 2024, you organized an exhibition at Rosecliff Mansion in Newport titled Gilded Age Newport in Color, The African Heritage Experience in Newport, Rhode Island, with the Rhode Island Black Heritage Society and the Newport Mansions. What inspired the exhibition, and talk about the impact of that exhibition and other events connected with it.
First of all, I've been a long-term trustee of the Preservations of Newport County, which manages our Newport Mansions, and I've done much of the historical interpretations of, the Gilded Age from an early perspective of families of color. And my wife, Theresa, and I, for years, have been documenting and writing narratives with regards to what Newport was like during the Gilded Age, but through the experiences of African heritage men, women, and families. And we're also both very much related to ancestors who are very much tied to that. I mean, my great-great-grandparents are, and their ancestors are living in Philadelphia, Boston, New York, and are summering in Newport. In fact, the Colored American newspaper in 1886, that is the leading Black newspaper of America at that time from Washington, D.C. Um, that year, they have a headline article about Newport being the place for middle and upper middle class Black families to spend their summers. It's Newport. And in fact, their quote is, "If there was a watering place in America where respectable, refined, and well-bearing colored ladies and gentlemen have as little reason to feel their race or color, it's Newport, Rhode Island." So that article, that feature became a draw. So many of the leading families were spending their summers in Newport during the Gilded Age. And that's roughly between 1865 and about 1920.
The exhibition itself was inspired by a lecture that we had done. I believe it was in 2018, Keith,
Yes.
2019, at Rosecliff Mansion. And the reason behind that lecture was, as Keith said, this is something that we had been researching for a long time and interesting characters that were involved in that time. But really, it was about how people lived. And we hear a lot, being Newport residents, we hear a lot about the Gilded Age uh, on a daily basis. But these are stories that are more important to us. These are stories that impact us. And we wanted others to be able to experience that as well.
And what's wonderful is that that exhibit is also accessible online, even though the actual exhibition closed in 2024, but people can still go online and get some of that experience of that history. So we're interested in the background of the African heritage history and the free African societies we've heard you talk about in some of your online lectures in Newport. And just as a background, when Michon and I toured Newport, it was one of those bus tours back in 2010. The only kind of reference to an African or Black presence in Newport was the mention of the Brown family earning their wealth through what were called international enterprises. So we're really interested in knowing more. What was, as you were talking about, the lives of people in Newport, of African heritage people in Newport that you and Keith bring to life through your work?
I think we started, very young because this was a part of our whole lives of what we were doing. But to us, it was important that people understood that the African heritage people of Newport had been there for a very, very long time, since the founding of the city. And we needed people to understand that the history that you often hear on tours is not as inclusive as we would have wanted. Certainly in 2010, it still was not as inclusive as we would have wanted. But Black history is American history. And that's no more important than any place than Newport, Rhode Island, because of the rich history that's there. I think that, their lives and what the things that they were able to develop from there, what we call creative survival, what they did outside of simple enslavement was more important. How they got there was just a fact of how they got there. It's what they did afterwards.
Yeah, I would say that I think the challenge is that uh, our Black history is still being interpreted through a owner class lens. And even though it might be well-intentioned, it's not us. And I think it's important to recognize that African heritage people and our descendants dating back to the African continent had culture, had reformed societies, had trade skills, had political organizations, had economic and social and religious success well before European interaction or first contact. So my Newport grandmother would remind me as a little boy, uh, slavery is not Black history. Black history is how our ancestors survived and thrived despite slavery. And she was a woman of color who attended Wilberforce in the 1890s and lived in Harlem, in Somerton, Newport, and was very much embodied in many, many African heritage families who lived and prospered well before the end of the American Civil War. And that was really, I think, culminated in the Gilded Age era, which brought those families together. These are families, for the most part, were part of what we now call the first emancipation. Most of us today, when we think about emancipation in America, we default to obviously the end of the Civil War and the end of slavery, which clearly emancipated nearly 4 million Black men and women and children. But well before that, in fact, by the end of the 18th century, with the beginnings and the formation of now the United States of America, the 13 colonies, particularly in New England, you have close to 100,000 now free African men and women. What's most important is many of those African men and women still retained or reclaimed their African identities and culture. So when you think in terms of what were the first free Black churches in America, the first benevolent societies, the first free Black schools, free meaning we owned it, we operated it, we manage it. It's not happening in the American South. It doesn't happen until after the Civil War. It's happening places like Boston, Philadelphia, Bridgeport, Connecticut, Providence, Rhode Island. This is an important chapter of the history of people of color in America that is very well known by we in the community, but less by the majority community. And I think in 2025, our goal is to engage the entire community. You understand the relevance and the important contributions of African American men, women, and children.
And I'm sure you and our audience and Taquina and I picked up on the use of the term international enterprises in that tour, which alludes to the slave trade, the transatlantic slave trade. So this is why this history is so very important.
Well, the transatlantic slave trade, I think, again, it's from an interpretation perspective. What we know is that nearly 4 centuries, over 10 to possibly 12 million African men, women, and children survived the transatlantic trade movement from West Africa to the West Indies and eventually to the Americas. So many more, countless died along that trip. But for the most part, when we think of slavery in America, we tend to, again, think about antebellum South. We're not thinking about Portsmouth, New Hampshire, Boston, Massachusetts, New Haven, Connecticut, Newport, Rhode Island. We're thinking about Savannah, Georgia, Richmond, Virginia, Mobile, Alabama. But for the most part, during that colonial era, many of the enslaved Africans that arrived eventually to New England shores, many arrived from what was called by the slaver class the Gold Coast. Today, we recognize that as northern Nigeria, the Yoruba-speaking people, most of Ghana, the Akan-speaking people. And what you see is that as they arrived, they did not arrive as a blank slate. They brought their culture, their language, their religion. And in fact, many of the early African-American institutions, not only in America, but you see in Barbados and Jamaica and Bahamas, have very Akan Yoruba influence, both in their language, their customs, the services, even the burial services that we have to this day, very much reflect many of the Akan burial systems that were carried over. So from my perspective, if you really want to learn and understand not only America's participation in the transatlantic slave trade, you have to understand those men, women, and children that survived it and who they were, and how they not only contributed to building America, but they contributed to the social and economic and cultural and even religious aspects of the America that we have to this day.
To your point, Michon, as you know, you were saying in the tour that you took, and the things that were going on and how you learn it. The problem is that African heritage history so far educationally has always been embedded in the slave trade. And so we learned a lot about, you know, how the enslaved arrived here and the work that they had to do. But more importantly, or less importantly, I actually should say, we usually learn about the owners and the ship captains, the slave traders. And everyone seemed to have thought that was Black history. The truth is that isn't. That is, Black history is what happened in spite of all of that and what they did with it and how they survived it.
Agreed.
Absolutely. Now, in your lectures, you've used the term African heritage community. Define that for our listeners.
You want to
Well,
take that or shall I?
I mean, we can both do that. I mean, from my perspective, the term African heritage recognizes that we're all a part of a greater diaspora. We always have been and always will be. And I know a few years back, I visited the Dominican Republic to present a lecture to historians, tourism folks in Santo Domingo with regards to the Dominicans' connection to the transatlantic slave trade. And one of the first things I said was the one thing that ties this island between Haiti and the Dominican Republic is that most of you have African ancestors. And people got very upset with me. I mean, they were like, I'm not Haitian, I'm not African, I'm Dominican. I'm saying, that's your nation of origin, but your racial heritage is African. And in fact, the only difference from you and me in America is an extra boat trip from Ghana. And it was difficult because I think the challenge that we face each and every day is that we don't own our history. And our history has been weaponized against us. So we don't want to embrace our African identity, our African heritage and culture, regardless of nation of birth, race, color, social class. It divides us. So we've used the term African heritage to recognize the fact that you could be African American, you're Jamaican, Dominican, Cubano, Nigerian, of mixed race, Cape Verdean, but you still share that heritage. And from our perspective, that allows us to recognize that today in 2025, the future majority population in America are going to be people of African and Latino heritage. That's the future. So I think the more that we can, particularly young people, embrace them and have them embrace their true heritage and identity, the more that we empower them to be great citizens and great contributors like their ancestors before them were.
I think also it's important to note that saying African heritage versus African American or Black or anything else, it's a more inclusive term. There are, a number of people of African heritage who are from, as Keith pointed out, the Dominican, Central and South America, who don't see themselves as Black and certainly not as African Americans. So this allows everyone, whether African-born, American-born, wherever in the diaspora that they are born, or if they're of mixed race, to embrace their African heritage.
It's kind of interesting. It's like the term American, when at one time it meant anyone from the Americas
Mhm.
in Europe. It is a way of encompassing a broader geography, a broader heritage and culture
And identity, for
and
sure.
identity. Yeah.
Another term that I've heard you use, Soni and Keith, is you talk about African heritage peoples having an interdependent relationship, which you've distinguished from integration. Tell us about how African heritage communities who were descended from free African societies lived interdependence. And we're especially interested in the social and cultural life of the community. I mean, you talked about the businesses, the schools, the churches that they develop. But talk about how building these institutions contributed to that value of uplift and how interdependence is different from integration in terms of its role in the identity formation for African heritage peoples.
Again, when we hear the term integration, that's a term that largely is formatted around and interpreted through an owner class or majority class perspective, not an African heritage experience. Um, and I think what's important to understand is that once we recognize that African heritage people either maintained or reclaimed their African identities before, during, and after enslavement, and then they would literally extend that experience in building their first institutions, the first Black churches. You think of the first Black churches in America. You think of Reverend Richard Allen in the African Methodist Episcopal Church, Mother Bethel in Philadelphia, alongside the first African Episcopal Church with Reverend Absolute Jones of St. Thomas. You look at the African Baptist Church in Boston, and you begin to understand that when they're starting these institutions, along with their schools and even their benevolent societies, the Prince Hall, it's the African Lodge, it's the African Church, it's the African School. So they were already reclaiming and also pronouncing as free African heritage people in the 18th and early 19th century, this is who we are, and these are our institutions. Their goals were never to integrate in the larger white community. In fact, the larger white community rejected them. I mean, being free in the antebellum North, you still faced racial prejudice, significant racial prejudice. So those families who had trade skills, language skills, identities decided, we're not looking to integrate. We're looking to simply make our own decisions for the livelihoods of our own families and communities and children's. And we will build those institutions. That's not the Jim Crow South. The Jim Crow South was, again, the majority white community and their allies segregating, separating so that they can reduce resources and competitive equal resources to now free African people of the American South. But before that, they're beginning to establish their own institutions and organizations. And they're doing that because they have choice, free choice. And their choice was not to marry into white communities. Their choice wasn't to emulate the white community. In fact, the term in the Gilded Age, which has been put upon us, which is the Black elite, is not how those families saw themselves and conducted their lives. Their goals were not to be chocolate-covered Vanderbilts. Their goals were to be who they were and what they earned. And in fact, what you find is that these leading social activities that are going on at that time, really peaking at that time, they're just expressing not integration or the goal of integration, they're expressing interdependence. Interdependence is, this is who we are, this is who we're going to be, and we both agree that there are times when we have to work together and live together to prosper in a community. So that's why in Newport, when the Gilded Age really takes root and the elite families are looking for high-end and paying for high-end quality services, it is the African heritage community that step forth and provide those services. The leading tradesmen and tradeswomen, the leading service providers are not white populations, not white communities, white businesses. It's African heritage. In fact, Bellevue Avenue, our famous avenue that leads into our Gilded Age mansions, most of the businesses during that Gilded Age are Black-owned and operated. So again, interdependence is a very important difference in understanding the African heritage experience and history in America. It's one of building their own lives free and independent of any other community.
I think also when we talk about interdependence, it's basically a cleaning up of our language and how we see things. When I hear the words assimilation or integration, it's when you take a foreign substance and assimilate it into your own or into, your way of doing things. That's not what the founding of America was. There's a reason we never had an official language or an official religion because it was never intended to be that. We're supposed to be interdependent on each other. And so that doesn't just mean that the interdependence is of the African heritage side. It's the other side as well. They are dependent on each other because isn't that what Americans are all about? We're supposed to be working together and being dependent upon each other. It doesn't mean that we change who we are. And I think that's why the popularity of saying things like African American, Irish American, Latino American was to identify, oh yeah, I'm an American, but this is my background. I don't think we need to do that. We're all Americans as we are, and it was never intended to be the analogy of a melting pot. I like to think of it more as a stew. Each vegetable is independent of itself, but at the same time is part of a whole. That's what America is. And I think the term interdependence better describes that.
Yeah, from what you're saying, it's the e pluribus part of e pluribus unum, from the many, one. And the one isn't an erasure of our origin stories or our origins. It's a recognition that together we make this unity with our distinctions.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Now, before we pressed record for this podcast, it seems like you both have been involved as advisors to season 3 of The Gilded Age, the HBO series. And you're looking forward to a big premiere in Newport, which is not by accident.
Right.
The Gilded Age shows prominent Black families living in Newport in the 1880s. One family, the Kirklands, is descended from 5 generations of free African Americans or free Africans. The mother, Elizabeth, has an ancestry that goes back to the American Revolution. She makes a point of that. The father, Frederick Kirkland, is a pastor. The younger son, William, is a doctor who was trained at Howard University's medical school here in D.C., where we are. And William's brother is a Yale graduate. And we see a Black dressmaker, and we see businesses and society, people being social on the beach, etc., and probably giving too much away. But tell us, who would the Scots who are from Brooklyn and the Kirklands rub shoulders with in Newport at that time?
So many people, but I think that of the ones that you mentioned, I'm going to let Keith talk specifically about the Kirklands and all of that. But certainly when you talk about the dressmaker, that is Mary Dickerson. And Mary Dickerson, in my mind, is one of the most prominent female entrepreneurs of that time. Uh, in real life, she's the founder of the Colored Women's Clubs, and which still exists today. She's a dressmaker who came up here from New Haven, Connecticut, and after the death of her first husband, she is visiting friends up here. Um, it was a couple years after, and she meets Silas Dickerson, who is a grocer and owns a number of properties as well. She takes what she makes, dressmaking in it, and to set this up for you, her dressmaking shop is on Bellevue Avenue, and that wasn't an accident. It was at the time when all the mansions were being built, New York, elite were coming up here, and so she knew that she could make a good business there. And she takes the profits from that and then turns around and, on one side, invests it into properties that she then rented to African heritage people who were up here working. And on the other side, used it for the Colored Women's Clubs and for setting up things that, in my mind, were so revolutionary. Um, Women of color who had to work basically had to leave their kids at home. And so you had, 8-year-olds taking care of 2-year-olds. She had probably one of the first daycare centers within the club, and they would come, they'd drop off the kids there, they can go to work, they could come back, and the kids would be safe, well cared for. Those types of things I think were revolutionary for the time. But by the time of her passing, she owned 7 properties, was listed on the tax rolls as one of the highest taxpayers at the time, particularly the highest tax-paying woman. But what she did socially and her business is just amazing. I think that's someone that the Kirklands would definitely want to know. Keith, do you want to talk about them?
No,
I was going to leave that one to you.
it's fascinating to see drama accurately portray real life people and living experiences. I mean, that's my ancestors' experience. I mean, uh, you know, Dr. Marcus Wheatland, who's a real person, who's a graduate from Barbados, and then on to Washington, D.C., and an early graduate of Howard Medical School, along with Dr. Alonzo Horn, his friend, a graduate. Wheatland becomes one of the first doctors in America to use the X-ray machine as a diagnostic tool. And Dr. Van Horn is the dentist to the leading families with the leading equipment. These are all a part of my family and ancestors. We still have a lot of their artifacts, which is fascinating. And they're all products of Howard Medical School. They also go on to found the American Medical Association, because back at that time, there are a number of Black men and women. In fact, we had 4 Black doctors in the Gilded Age of Newport, including a woman. They were active in Newport. But at that time, they would petition to become part of the American Medical Association. They were denied because they were Black, or colored, as it was said at that time. So independently, they formed their National Medical Association and such. So I think what's important about these stories is that these are self-made men and women, and their success comes from their interdependent choices that their family and ancestors in church and religious and educational institutions gave them. You'll see the Yale is interesting because at that time, most of our families of color, including all of my ancestors, would have been graduating from Hampton, Howard, Wilberforce.
Oberlin.
Absolutely, Oberlin. In fact, I have a great aunt who is a first Black graduate of the Boston Conservatory of Music, and she's living in Newport and Harlem, and she's teaching at Oberlin. So, Yale, not until my generation do you see Cornell. I mean, I get to go to Cornell because my parents and grandparents and ancestors were able to go and achieve through historically Black colleges. I have these choices, and we have these choices today because of what our ancestors did for us through historically Black colleges and universities. And I hope in these interpretations they recognize that, because again, it's interdependent in such. I mean, Julian Fellowes, I think the world of, and the team that he has that have been producing this show. They've done a wonderful job. They've been very supportive to us in Newport. The production staff's been outstanding. The Peggy Scott character is absolutely accurate. I mean, again, I have an ancestor in Newport who's a graduate of the Colored Institute. She's a dressmaker. I have another one who's an author. We have photographs, and if I showed you the photographs, you say, "Oh my goodness, that's Peggy Scott." So what's exciting for me is that this series is done so well and very appropriately interpreting the history of African heritage men, women, and families at that time in the place that they occupied. Obviously, and I want to be clear, what we call the Gilded Age for the rest of America was the Progressive Era. And it was a time of lynchings. It was a time of racial discrimination. It was a time of union breaking. And it was a very difficult time for most other Americans. And that's equally important for us to recognize. And that's why, again, if my late grandmother was here on the show with us, the first thing she would remind us is, don't call us elite. We were actively engaged in writing letters, in forming organizations, in assisting our brothers and sisters in the South who were being oppressed. They were very much involved in anti-lynching laws. They were very much involved in actually encouraging African heritage people from leaving sharecropping Jim Crow South and coming into Newport. In fact, many of the families that begin to succeed in Newport in the Gilded Age, they're not only coming from the South, they're coming from Culpeper County, Virginia. We have dozens and dozens of families that are being fast-tracked from Culpeper County to Newport, and they become a part of the contributing leading families of the Gilded Age. So these are stories that people wouldn't know, but we need to know, because we're always been interconnected. From Africa to Culpeper to Newport, we're always been interconnected.
Yes. Speaking of Culpeper, our mother's roots are in Culpeper, Virginia. And Michon is an Oberlin graduate who did a project called The History of Black Women at Oberlin College. And her research is now in the Schomburg. So these threads are just everywhere.
I got to send you a wonderful photograph. I have my great aunt, who's the Oberlin teacher in Harlem, music teacher. Her husband's the first Black graduate of Rutgers. He's a lawyer. They're part of the Harlem Renaissance. And I have a wonderful photograph of them in the summer at the beach in Newport, sitting, enjoying themselves at the beach and summering at the beach. And I mean, that was their experience. But both of them were intimately involved in uplifting the Black communities of Newport, New York, and America. They never left those roots.
You've been enjoying Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters, a podcast where we talk about historical drama series and films as windows to the past and mirrors of the present.
Visit our webpage at michonbostongroup.com/Boston Sisters. Share this podcast. Join our historical drama community by signing up for our newsletter to stay up to date on future episodes and bonus content.
Now, back to our podcast conversation.
One of the central themes in the Gilded Age series is class. And what we see is wealthy white women organize charities, fundraisers, serve on committees, hold social events, and support cultural institutions as a way of building and maintaining their status in society. Now, in what we've just talked about and in your talks about Newport's African heritage communities, there's a different value system operating. Talk about the women, more of the women of African heritage in Newport's Gilded Age, I'm doing quotes here, and how they use their education, their wealth, their social standing to make political advancements for the community.
Shall I go ahead, Keith?
Yes, Soni, you do the women, I'll do the men.
Okay, a little stereotypical, but I'll do it. Because he's just as conversant in the women as I am, sometimes more so. I started by telling you about Mary Dickerson and some of the things, but let me start first, because you start with the statement that class status is a central theme. Class status exists, different statuses exist in every society. It's whether it's good, bad, indifferent, whatever, we've always recognized that there are different classes. The difference in some societies, and was true in the African heritage community, is that one did not live without the other, and one didn't ignore the other. And so you had things like Mary Dickerson worrying about how the children of a laundress were being cared for while she was working. Mary Dickerson, in her obituary, one of the things that stated is that she did everything to uplift her race. And so there was always that sort of the modern day way when we talk about childbirth, as we say, it takes a village. But that really comes from, in my mind, the way African communities ran. Everyone took care of everyone. No one was left to starve. No one was left without shelter. And I think that that's the way the women in Newport, particularly other places as well, but Newport really focused on that. So those who succeeded and were doing well worked hard in their political involvements in everything that they did to increase the status of even the lowest of the community.
Yeah, I would just add that the issue is less being class conscious, but race conscious. Class is an effect of what you've earned in life and how you live your life and such. But you might live at the highest level or lowest level, but you still have to be conscious of your race and ethnicity and heritage. And one very good example of that is by the 1890s, Newport is taking off, homes are being built, societies are being established. And what really attracted people to Newport becomes the first modern day summer tourism resort. And you actually see the advent of recreational tourism, sailing, early motocross races, the earliest golfing, tennis. That's all taking part in Newport. And African heritage communities that have means are doing the same. You have early tennis clubs that are taking part, fishing clubs, biking clubs. In fact, one interesting story, my grandfather and my great uncle, they were part of a African heritage men's club, all college educated, and they loved to fish and they loved to socialize. And at that time, the Spouting Rock Beach Association was established. We call Bailey's Beach along the Ocean Drive, which is today one of the most exclusive white beach clubs. African heritage men weren't looking to be a part of Bailey's Beach. So what did they do? They established the Ugly Man's Fishing Club. And the Ugly Man's Fishing
I
Club
love
was a
that
fishing
name.
club of black men because they would go out on Ocean Drive and they would fish and they would have events around that. And their inside joke was, the reason they called it the Ugly Man's Fishing Club is that, well, look, we're highly educated, we're prominent businessmen, we're well respected, we have culture, but I don't think they want us in these clubs anyway. It's got to be because we're ugly. It can't be anything else. So that inside joke, that wink and nod is, we're interdependent. We don't define ourselves as being a part of the organizations. We enjoy to fish, we play tennis, we golf, we socialize, we want our kids to be successful, and we'll create our own venues and succeed within it and such. And today we see that in the evolution of the Jack and Jill Club. You see that in the evolution of social events that still take place. But it wasn't to separate classes within Black folks. It was to make it clear that any person of African heritage, if they want to golf, we'll have a venue for you. If you want to fish, we'll have a venue for you. You want to dance, we'll have a venue for you. That's interdependence. And it's being race conscious. It's recognizing the fact that even though we're ready to succeed, the world has to catch up. So it's a very different understanding of how people live their lives if you take it from a Black experience versus a majority experience.
We've talked quite a bit about education, whether it was the establishment of the free African schools, whether it's the fact that you have many people who are college graduates in the Newport Society, who are members of the African heritage community. And education has been historically seen as a tool for Black advancement, upward mobility, etc. So in that we look at history as and historical drama not only as a window to the past, but a mirror of our own time. Do you see the value of education for African heritage people in our own time? And, how does it mirror how the kind of values that we would see in that Newport Gilded Age community, African heritage community?
Soni, you first.
Well, I'm going to take it a step back from the higher education. I've approached the idea of teaching history and heritage to our younger kids, whether it's middle school, high school. We run a youth group for high school, and it's based on the idea that if you know your heritage and you know the achievement of others that look like you will adopt a better identity. So your identity will be formed from achievement versus trauma.
Mm.
And I think that is something that we have lacked because our educational system as a whole is based on a set of ideas that was formed in the earliest 20th century at a time when, recognizing your heritage wasn't a part of it. And that has created an insecurity, I think, amongst many of us, whether we're Black or brown, Latino, Asian, whatever. We don't see ourselves in the history we're taught, and it isn't a part of our curriculums. And therefore, there's that insecurity of, well, but that isn't really me. I'm not a part of that. And so teaching them at a young age their heritage and their history helps them to form an identity that allows them better success and prepares them for that next step, which is higher education.
And I see it simply from the evolution of the heritage of African people. You know, having access to education and trade skills goes back to the very beginnings of the African continent. I mean, let's look at it from this perspective. Africa is the world's second largest and second most populated continent in the world. And before first European set foot in the African continent, before the slave trade, there are major African empires. We think of the Mali Empire, the King Nauru, the Yoruba, the Akan Empire, the Ashanti. I mean, these were tradesmen and craftsmen. I mean, these were men and women who, dating back to the third or fourth centuries, were leading blacksmiths and weavers and goldsmiths and stuff. You think of Ghana, it's the goldsmiths, the trades and such. Craft skills, they're all tied back to today's Ghana, Nigeria, Ivory Coast, Gambia. Cotton was being woven in the Sudan thousands of years ago. So when these Africans were brought here forcibly as enslaved, many of them brought with them these skills, trade skills, and these capabilities. There's no surprise that many Gold Coast Africans would land in New England because they had very strong ability for trade skills. I have an ancestor. He's 8 years old in 1795. He's emancipated, and then he's sent to Philadelphia to be a Windsor chairmaker and cabinet maker. If he was sent to the American South, he might be in a rice plantation or a cotton field or tobacco. But in New England and the North, where we don't have, cash crop cultivation economies, it's trade skills, these Africans are highly sought after and they perfect it. So by the time that they become free, they have very sophisticated trade skills, capabilities that have immediate positive impact in the larger economy. So I default back to the fact that the history of education, the history of trade is the part of the DNA of being an African heritage person. And my wife does a wonderful job of engaging kids of color with history so that they can understand who they are today stands on the shoulders of men and women who succeeded thousands of years before them. And they have every right to succeed in Rhode Island or America today as their ancestors strived to survive at that time. So it's history and factual history that can empower people to have successful, vibrant lives today and in the future. And I think that's how I've always tried to interpret history, particularly for people of color.
It's interesting what you said, Soni, about let's talk about like K through 12, because when I was in fifth grade, that was when we had our American history module, and there were no Black people until we got to slavery.
Yeah.
And I think that's been true in America's public school system. It's just always been that way because and it's easy to point fingers and say why and et cetera. But the truth is, a group of educated educators who were sitting down and doing curriculums on a national level were picking and choosing, what was important, and that model has continued all the way to today. And I think that, and there's been, studies talking about not just the heritage side of it, not just the lack of diversity in it, but also the fact that, the model doesn't work for everyone. Some people don't learn the same way. There's different things. So that's in need of rehabilitation, or redesign. But when you're talking about higher education, I see it as not specifically just college. It could be the arts. It could be trades. As again, college is not for everybody, and everybody has different abilities. What the most important aspect I see of it is accessibility. That there's access for everyone into whichever form of higher education they want. Because truthfully, without it, how do you move forward? You have to have some form of education in order to move forward. And the thing that will hold us back is lack of access to that.
It's also common sense. I mean, again, I would not be able to recognize the important contributions of Irish people by similarly focusing on the Irish potato famine. I would not
Right.
focus
Yeah.
on the incredible contribution of the Jewish religion and Jewish people on the Spanish Inquisition. And I wouldn't certainly look at Europeans from the lens of simply the bubonic plague. So to simply define African heritage and history through the slave trade, we need to understand it. We need to understand its impacts. But again, I default back to my grandmother of the Gilded Age, who kept reminding me slavery is not Black history. And I think our obligation today and the future is to tell the entire Black history.
And I want to appreciate that the Rhode Island Black Heritage Society, you're giving youth experiences to engage with history. I saw on your socials some had come on I would call it a pilgrimage. I think they went to the Caribbean, but they also went to the National Museum of African American History and Culture. So when you talk about various ways that people learn and engage with knowledge making, I really appreciate how you've done it through your own historical society by getting youth to go to the places where history has happened and really engage with it. And you're both leaders in what I would call the historical and heritage movement and of institutions. What makes it important for people to be supporting heritage and historical institutions like the Rhode Island Black Heritage Society and the other kinds of heritage and historical groups that you're a part of?
Well, I think that, for us, the group that you're talking about is actually called Birthright Rhode Island.
Mm-hmm.
And we call it birthright because it is their birthright to know their heritage and to know that they can achieve. And so it's a 2-year adulting program. The kids give up their Saturdays to do this. It's not during a school day. They're all junior and senior high school students. And the trips that you were talking about, Taquina, is that we made an effort to make sure that they understood that they're part of a diaspora and that they need to know the other people in that diaspora. And so part of the curriculum is going to Washington, D.C. To learn the history there, but also because it's important for them to know. We try to teach civics at the same time. They need to know how government works so that they know what they have to work with as Americans. And so we go and visit the Capitol and we do a tour. Our senators have been wonderful in spending massive amount of times with the students while we're there. And from there, we have to go somewhere in the diaspora. So last year it was St. Thomas in the Virgin Islands. This year was Puerto Rico.
Mm.
And I will say that was probably one of the most eye-opening trips for the students. There was so much African history in there that they were able to touch. And now we're looking next year to go to Cape Verde. So
Oh,
they visit,
wow.
I wanted them to visit the African side of it as well.
Yeah.
But this is what heritage institutions do. And without the support of the community, we can't do it. We don't charge the students anything for any of their trips, for any of the things we do. Um, it's community that comes together and makes sure that these things can happen. And I think that without that, as has happened in the past, many of our heritage institutions end up closing their doors because they just cannot, sustain themselves. So I think that if you want your students and your children to know these things, you have to support the institutions that are able to give it to them.
One of our guests on the podcast, who was an advisor to Sanditon, her family is descended from the Cape Verdeans who came to Newport, Rhode Island.
Yes. We have a large Cape Verdean community here.
Yeah.
But, just to add with the Cape Verdean histories, which is so important, the Cape Verdean people who largely landed in the 19th and 20th century, New Bedford, Massachusetts, and then Providence around the east side, they arrived here not enslaved.
Right.
So they are the first in group of African heritage people who arrived early in America, but not enslaved. Today, they're coming from the African continent and such. So the Cape Verdean history is exceedingly important to understand because as they come, they bring their skills, their mariner skills, their trade skills and such, and become significant contributors to the economies of places like New Bedford, Martha's Vineyard, Providence, Rhode Island, Fall River, into Connecticut. I mean, these are all important stories. But again, it's all a part of the diaspora because the Cape Verde is not off the coast of Portugal. It's off the coast of Senegal, West Africa.
Right. Yeah.
So the next time we come to Newport, or anyone who's planning a visit to Newport, what are your recommendations for seeing Newport's Black history today?
The must-sees.
The must-sees or experiences.
First off, let the Rhode Island Black Heritage Society know you're coming.
Absolutely.
Hopefully tailor something so that you will enjoy your experience. And also because we often have literature that will help you on self-guided walking tours and things like that. And then, of course, if there are any events going on at the time, we can let you know about those. But I think it's very important that if they're coming to Newport, one of the very first stops has to be God's Little Acre, which is the oldest and largest burying ground of both free and enslaved Africans. And there's so much history just on that 1 acre of land that I don't think people really understand how much we can learn from their physical touchstones to history. So definitely that. Keith, what else? What would you do next?
No, I think you're right. I think it's important to engage the Rhode Island Black Heritage Society, be it a directed tour or obviously a visit to God's Little Acre, because what makes Newport special and unique as compared to other colonial cities, in fact, Newport has more pre-American Revolutionary existing structures than any city in America. I mean, we're including Boston, New York, and such. And the challenge is that many of those homes and structures and places of worship are still active and largely in private hands. So it becomes an interpretation challenge. So today, in fact, I think we have 800 Airbnbs in Newport. So that's a whole other challenge. So the challenge becomes you have these structures and homes today where people are living in and summering in and investing in, but have no idea that 200-300 years ago, African heritage people lived, worked, and worshiped there. No idea. We'd have to put 20 plaques on every home if we were going to encompass the stories and histories of everyone through 4 centuries, but we obviously can't do that. So I know the Black Heritage Society, to their credit, are working on digitalizing collections, social media, online tours, virtual tours, so that we can give people the experience of what it was like for people of color 100, 200, 300 years ago, but also having to deal with the reality that we don't own these sites and we may not have access to these sites. So I really believe it's technology, digital technology and social media platforms will be the future of engaging a much larger audience, very much like this podcast today, in exploring this history. But it all comes down to institutions like the Rhode Island Black Heritage Society. I mean, the society has one of the largest collections and has the largest in Rhode Island, in one of the largest in New England collections dating back to the colonial era. And it's an affiliate to the African American Museum Association. This is absolutely essential. I mean, my wife has 2 full-time archivists, young people of color who are professionally trained to prepare, to catalog, and preserve our heirlooms. Many, many Black institutions don't have those assets. And I think it's absolutely essential that we support every single Black historical institution that's collecting, cataloging, preserving our history. That's a priority.
And am I correct in saying that Rowena Stewart, who's considered the mother of African American museums at the Rhode Island Black Heritage Society, she was one of the founders?
Yes. So we're about to celebrate our 50th year. Rowena Stewart was, in fact, our founder. And, for me, it's especially gratifying to know because Rowena was my mentor.
Oh,
That's how
wonderful.
long I've been doing this. Not 50 years, 40, but
Yeah.
but still. And, as we're approaching our 50th, that's very much on my mind is making sure that her memory is always remembered here. Um, and that the work that she did. I mean, one of the things that I think she most impressed upon me was, as to Keith's point, Newport is a very open to interpretation type of place because whoever's giving you the tour, what's important to them is what you're going to see and hear because every building had, layers and layers of history in it. And she was the one that said, look, it's not enough to say there were enslaved that lived in this home, which is the normal way things have been going. It's important to let you know who was there, what they were doing, how they lived their lives. And then you get a richer feeling of what Newport is all about.
Yeah, I'm so happy that you recognize Rowena Stewart. I mean, my late mom is a part of a team of people in Rowena that founded the Black Heritage Society. My wife knew Rowena before she knew me. She didn't know
Oh.
anything about me at all. She knew Rowena Stewart, so she was actually with the right people in Rhode Island. So
Which surprised him.
yeah, yeah, we're just so proud to carry on the legacy of men and women such as Rowena Stewart and others whose shoulders we stand on. I mean, we are so fortunate to be able to share a history that was shared with us as very young people that we can carry forward.
I think it's also important to note we always call Rowena the founder, but it was actually a group of people who founded it. And one of them that really stands out in my mind is Fred Williamson, who was the first African Heritage Historic Preservation Officer for the state of Rhode Island. And I believe also your mentor, right, Keith?
Well, he's the longest serving state historic preservation officer in the nation. And again, Fred Williamson, as a kid, you know, set me up in meetings, gave me internships. He introduced me to the National Trust for Historic Preservation and urged me to be a part of it and become an advisor. So again, everything we do today stands on the shoulders of Black men and women before us, going back to the times of slavery, who set this path for us. And we just hope that we can just do them justice in the work that we do today.
Yeah, the last person I'm going to mention, Keith briefly mentioned her, but I'm going to really expand on that, and that's his mother,
Uh,
who, over the past, I mean, we just lost her 2 years ago, so for nearly 40 years, she was always conversing with me on the history of Newport. I had a better understanding of Newport during World War II because of the stories she told me, which was the time period that she was forming her family, and just and so supportive. And she helped with the establishment of the Black Heritage Society and remained, interested and involved with me on that all the way through her life.
well, I have to say, I mean, you two, both in terms of your personal family histories and your historical gathering of stories, um, there, I mean, this podcast is about historical films and dramatic series, and there are a lot of stories that could be rich series. I like series better because it gives you, the opportunity to kind of stretch out and get more of a sense of people's history than just kind of like a famous figure. If someone said, "Well, we want to do a story about some period of history in Rhode Island or Newport's African heritage history, what stories would you like to see come to the screen?
What are you going to pitch to the people at the Gilded Age premiere?
Okay, Keith, take it. Keith?
I would always default to the colonial era because again, November 10th, 1780, very important date. That's when the first African Union Societies organized in Newport. And these free Africans, we know because the records still exist within the Newport Historical Society and Rhode Island Black Heritage Society in their minute books. And these Africans immediately, we didn't have internet or telephones or cars back then or high-speed vehicles. So they immediately, being a maritime port, put letters on ships. And then those ships landed in Philadelphia, Boston, New York, and Providence. And between 1780 and 1787, they all formed African societies. And this became the nexus of free African identity in America. This became the Black founders of America. And what was going on in Philadelphia was simultaneously going on in Boston, New York, Newport, Providence, because they're all interchanging letters. I mean, Africans in Philadelphia, Reverend Richard Allen, James Fortune, are reaching out to their Newport friends and saying, hey, we want to go to Boston. Can you introduce us to this guy called Prince Hall? Because we don't know him, but we think he's doing interesting things in Boston. And the Newport Africans send a letter and introduce him to Prince Hall. As a kid of color and a nerdy young kid of color, to be able to see men and women that look like me and my family achieving in 1780, I mean, how cool is that?
Mhm.
And so I would love to see a series on the evolution of African identity and freedom. I would call it the Black Founders of America, if I could. And I would talk about those men and women and who they are, because the one thing we have, unlike other historical dramas, we have primary documents and evidence. We can create very accurate, very factual interpretations of these men, women, and families and the institutions they created, unlike many others. So that would be my fun. If I had lots of money and lots of times, that would be my fun, because it would be an incredible story that, again, emphasizes what my Gilded Age grandmother kept telling me. It's not about slavery. It's about freedom and survival and achievement. And it would all be embodied in that colonial era.
Sounds like a pitch to me, Keith.
Yeah.
I think if it was me, definitely the colonial era, because there's so many characters and stories there that are wonderful. My hobby on the other side is fiction. And so, I love seeing or writing stories about those people who did things with, a twist. I know right now the movie Sinners is really popular, and they've taken a piece of history and then given it that vampiric twist.
Mhm.
But I even wrote one about Duchess Cormina's husband who dies in the Battle of Block Island, but it became a time travel story.
Mm.
I challenge writers out there right now, go to real history, because guess what? Truth is better than fiction, and if you're using
Yes.
truth to create your fiction, it's even better. Um, you know, Even the Gilded Age. Look at the Gilded Age. You could take just the African heritage community in Newport and create a wonderful drama based on them in the Gilded Age.
Totally.
I think Keith once gave me the title of, we'll call it the Hilltoppers,
Yeah.
because they lived at the top of the hill. But those kinds of stories are rich and engaging, and you can make them very dramatic. And I mean, that's kind of the nice thing about fiction. You can put words in people's mouths and be able to do things like that.
Yeah.
Which I think the Gilded Age has done really well. Just I'd like to see it as from the perspective of African heritage people.
But just a serious note with that, because again, one of the extraordinary ironies of Black excellence in American history is the physical spaces that are today occupied largely by non-people of color. So when we talk about early Black historical communities, we talk about Beacon Hill in Boston.
Mm-hmm.
Newport, it's Bellevue Avenue, Historic Hill. In Providence, Rhode Island, it's College Hill, where Rhode Island School of Design and Brown University is. In Philadelphia, it was called the Historic 7th Ward. These were where the nexus of early Black religious, educational, commerce, benevolent institutions all began in the 18th and peaked in the Gilded Age. Today, these communities are some of the most historic communities in America. but have little or no Black presence. And when you look at today, the fact that people of African descent today in America, their household family wealth, their personal net worth is far below, unfortunately, white counterparts. What would it be if people of color held on to those properties in Beacon Hill or College Hill or Bellevue Avenue, Newport? What would it be like if people of color held on to those properties, transferred and that wealth to the next generation? Where would we be as Black people in America economically? So it is so essentially important for us to recognize that history tells us a lesson of Black excellence, but also tells us the lessons of what we lost in property, in value, and opportunity because of the ongoing challenges that exist to this day of racial discrimination.
And that's a great last word for this interview. Thank you so much for this conversation.
And thank you so much for joining us on Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters. We wish you all the best for your work and for the important work of history that you're doing in Rhode Island for Black heritage communities.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
This wraps up our 4th podcast season. Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters will be on summer hiatus. The Gilded Age, the Emmy-nominated HBO original drama series from creator Julian Fellowes, debuts its 8-episode 3rd season Sunday, June 22nd at 9 p.m. Eastern Time and Pacific Time on HBO and will be available to stream on HBO Max. Discover more about Rhode Island's rich African historical heritage featured in this podcast by visiting the Rhode Island Black Heritage Society's website at riblackHeritage.org. Take a virtual tour of the exhibit Gilded Age Newport in Color, the African Heritage Experience in Newport, Rhode Island. Find the link in the webpage for this podcast, episode 74, at michonbostongroup.com/Boston Sisters. You'll also find the links to previous podcasts about the Gilded Age series on that page as well.
Subscribe to Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters wherever you enjoy your favorite podcasts. Listen to past episodes. Check out episode 73, our page-to-screen summer reads for historical drama watching and reading. Leave a review. Michon and I hope you'll give the podcast 5 stars. Sign up for the e-newsletter to stay up to date on new podcasts, bonus episodes, and historical drama-related resources and activities. You can find the link at michonbostongroup.com/Boston Sisters. Follow us on Instagram at Historical Drama Sisters and on Facebook at Historical Drama Boston Sisters. Like and share Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters on your social media.
This is Michon Boston.
And this is Tequina Boston.
We'll be back in the fall, and thank you for listening. We hope you enjoyed this episode of Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters, a podcast about historical films and series dramas. Visit our webpage at michonbostongroup.com/Boston Sisters.
Tell us what historical dramas you're watching. Who knows? We may do a show about it. Sign up for our newsletter, subscribe to the podcast, and share it with the people you know who binge on historical drama.
Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters is brought to you by the Michon Boston Group. The views and opinions expressed on Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters are those of the speakers and do not represent the positions or views of the Michon Boston Group, its clients, or affiliates. This is Michon Boston.
And this is Tequina Boston. Thank you for listening.